Hello, my name is Reva, Bhalla, and today I'm joined by my colleague Mark Fleming-Williams to discuss the ongoing migrant dilemma in Europe. So, Mark, you have been tracking this issue for a while, and why don't we start by you drawing out just a rough sketch of the numbers that we're looking at? What is the big shift that we've observed over the past year when it comes to the migrant flows?
So there has definitely been a huge uptick this year compared to previous years. And there's also been a big change in what route the migrants have been entering Europe. Historically, particularly in 2014, the beginning of this year as well, a lot of that flow was happening through the central Mediterranean route. So that was setting off from Libya and places along the North African coast and heading for Italy, particularly. And then from Italy, they would spread through the rest of the European Union. But the beginning of this year saw a new route open up in a big way. So, and that was going via Greece and from Turkey via Greece up through the Balkans and into the centre of Europe through that way. And when I say it's a new route, I mean it's existed for a long time, and there were previous waves in 2010, 2011. There was quite a lot of crossing over that border, the land border at that stage. But this year, just the numbers have spiraled. So 2014, about 170,000 people crossed the central Mediterranean route, and it's looking like a kind of similar year, in a similar number this year in terms of that route. But in 2014 on the eastern route, then it was 50,000, and so far this year we've seen 450,000. So the numbers have literally just exploded.
And so when we're evaluating that question of why the explosion, do you think that there's some level of inertia involved in this? You know, as migrants make their way into Europe, they settle down, they call their friends and families to come over, they advise on the best route. Turkey has been building up, in refugees itself, and at a certain point, it needed to release the valve. How do you see the reasoning behind the spike?
Well, sometimes these things are messy. Sometimes it's not entirely, as you say, inertia can be a thing. It's hard to sometimes hit a trigger. So the other thing to bear in mind here is that this upsurge is a lot about Syrians, particularly, taking this eastern Mediterranean route, rather than it's predominantly North Africans who take the route through the central Mediterranean. So Syria is a good place to look. In terms of Syrians crossing into Turkey, which is kind of the first step, then we see a huge surge towards the end of last year from northern Syria into Turkey. The number of Syrians in Turkey doubles in 2 months, from 800,000 to about 1.6 million. Wow. So again, a giant surge, and then from there we begin to see the flows increase through Europe, through Greece, from the start of the year. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that Greece gets a new government from January of this year, which is the Syriza government, who is a much more leftist government, which has a much more humanist kind of view towards immigrants, whereas previously it was the New Democracy government, which, and Greece for several years before now, has had a terrible reputation in terms of dealing with immigrants.
So what you're saying, Mark, is that the government in Athens is going to be more sympathetic to migrants as they come in.
Yeah, that's the way it seems to be. There's been a lot more of a flow of migrants actually getting through Greece, whereas before there was much more of a stopper kind of in place.
And that, of course, creates more problems for the Balkans. But let's take now a closer look at Turkey. So Merkel was just in Ankara this past weekend and trying to set up a big bargain for the Turks and trying to get Turkey to solve its migrant problem. So what's on the table here? What are the Europeans offering?
Well, I think it's really about what the Turks want, actually. I mean, from the European perspective, they have a rather difficult problem here. They can either, we've seen issues coming from the Balkans, where we've seen the European Balkan powers, countries like Hungary, which is just on the edge, and Croatia. Hungary's built a fence. You've got these issues actually coming further up the line in Europe, and then heading back down towards, they could try and plug the flow in Greece, but that would require trying to lean on the Greek government, which at the moment they're trying to lean on the Greek government to bring through all sorts of financial measures.
Right, so you don't want to give some additional leverage there.
Exactly.
Right?
They've spent most of the year trying to break the Greek resolve on the financial side. To then give them leverage to ask them favours on immigrants, that's difficult.
So back to Turkey.
Yeah, exactly. So back to Turkey. From Europe's perspective, Turkey is the obvious solution. And so they basically go to Turkey saying, what do you want from us? Which actually, to throw it back at you as a Turkey
the Turks,
correspondent.
I mean, there's several things, right? So one is the Turks are happy to take money. So when the Turks are saying they've already spent a total of 8 billion or so in taking in refugees, and so they're asking for another 3 billion to handle any new inflows. So that is something that I think the Europeans could oblige. Visa liberalization, that's been a big ask from the Turks for a long time, and so that likely will have some movement. The tricky one is when we get to opening up new chapters for Turkey's EU membership aspirations. And that's something that has really kind of lost interest in Turkey for some time. But, it's something that Turkey wants to show that it still has a foot in the West. And the EU membership negotiation is an example of that. And the opposition loves it because then they see that membership, or at least the process, as a sort of containment on Erdogan, that he can't go too far in his authoritarian ways if this process is a real thing. So
interesting. But the problem is, sorry, just to take that on, going back to Europe, that creates problems for Europe.
Right.
Because Angela Merkel, who is kind of the epicenter of this crisis in Europe, she is the one who set off originally with a kind of pro-immigrant stance, we'll take as many as you can send, has now received internal problems from her sister party, the Bavarian CSU party, about we can't handle these immigrants, basically. Bavaria is the front line of this immigration crisis. So that drove her initially to trying to fix this crisis. Now, Turkey's terms, if Turkey's terms are that Turkey should be allowed to enter the EU, then it creates a new problem with the CSU, because the CSU, being anti-immigrant, is also anti-Turk or anti-Turkish accession into the EU.
Not to mention the Cypriots, who are also going to be another veto in the bloc.
Absolutely. So the Cypriots are another complication as well. But so from Merkel's perspective, she goes to Turkey asking what you want in order to solve my immigrant problem, and Turkey's suggested solution actually potentially creates her more domestic political problems back home. So she hasn't really got a clear out at the moment.
And there's no real guarantee that Turkey's going to effectively limit the flow of migrants that are coming through Turkey. I mean, we're seeing a lot of kinetic activity in Syria these days. More refugees are coming in. This is what underscores Turkey's whole proposal for a safe zone in northern Syria, which the Europeans are keeping at arm's length for now. But I think the whole summation here is that there is no solution.
Yes, to an extent. I mean, there are things that the Turks can do. So when we saw the photo of the little boy on the beach, then it was interesting to get reports that all of the traffickers who were involved in that specific incident with that little boy were arrested by Turkey, which means that they do seem to have the ability to find the people responsible and stop them. Remember that now the current flows are in boats to the Greek islands rather than down the land border. So if there seems to be some kind of ability for the Turks
There's ability, but the political will is going to be a different thing to test.
As you say, and there is 2 million people, Syrians already living in Turkey, and can Turkey handle having more, actually, even if it did want to? So there are big question marks still. So
an interesting time for Turkey to have leverage with the Europeans, but Merkel can expect Turkey to solve her problems. In fact, it may exacerbate her problems at home. Thank you, Mark, for the very interesting discussion. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.